And I was thinking, what is home to Damasani? Because I understand, and Damasani understood very early in life, that home is where humanity is. Home is about humans.
The ones that are giving us a proper problem are still refusing to leave, which is the likes of the Nigerians, the Somalians, Ethiopians, the Pakistanis, the Bangladeshis. Those are the ones that have given us a serious problem, and they have this sense of entitlement that somehow they should stay in the country by hook or by crook. So we're just hoping that we'll have a government that takes this seriously and enforces much stricter ways of getting them to leave the country,
One South African leader asks whether home should be defined by humanity. Another names the national communities she believes government must make leave. But this is not simply a contest between compassion and immigration enforcement. It raises a deeper question. When South Africa looks at a Nigerian, Somali, Ethiopian, Pakistani or Bangladeshi person, does it first see an individual whose legal status must be established? Or has nationality itself become the verdict? Because the people named in that interview could include undocumented migrants, but they could also include recognized refugees, asylum seekers, permanent residents, valid visa holders, naturalized South Africans, spouses of citizens, and people who have committed no offense. Those categories are not interchangeable. And that distinction takes us directly to the warning delivered by MTN Group chairperson Mcebisi Jonas. Jonas delivered these remarks at the funeral of Thokozani Damasane, a Zimbabwean-born activist and public servant who relocated to South Africa and became deeply involved in its civic and public life. Jonas told mourners that he had heard people saying foreigners must go home while driving to the funeral, but he was travelling to honour a man whose life made the meaning of home far more complicated. Damasane was born elsewhere, yet according to Jonas, he immersed himself in the struggles and pain of South Africans and became one of them. So, Jonas asked, what was home to Damasane? Jonas is MTN Group's independent, non-executive chairperson and previously served as South Africa's Deputy Finance Minister. Reports of the funeral identify Damasane as a Zimbabwean-born activist and public servant who built much of his life in South Africa. Now, listen to Jonas's complete argument.
To say that in Damasane's strengths, our strength as South Africa and South Africans are reflected. And in his weaknesses, our own weaknesses are reflected. I'm saying this thing because somebody, as I was driving here, I was listening and reading something about something saying people must go home. And I was thinking, what is home to Damasane? Because I understand, and Damasane understood very early in life, that home is where humanity is. Home is about humanness. It is about the good of humanity and striving for the good of humanity. Damasane has defeated no. The tribe is a product of colonial powers. You would notice that it is so dominant in areas where the English conquered, because they use something called the principle of indirect rule. You've got to divide these people by psychologically enhancing the notion that one is different from the other. That's how the notion of tribe was born. It is probably the veil that covers and became a cover for ethnicity. So tribal is the greatest enemy that Africanism and Pan-Africanism has. And it is the greatest enemy that nationalism as South Africans will suffer as long as the tribe survives. That's how Samora used to put it. As long as the tribe survives, we will suffer. So you would see in the streets, it's no longer about whether you are from South Africa or not from South Africa. It's about the tribe. It's about who you are. You are not like us, and you are different, and therefore we have to persecute you. Something fundamental has been lost in our country. Something fundamental has been lost in our nation.
Jonas is not saying that anyone who enters South Africa automatically gains the right to remain. He is making a moral argument about belonging. A passport records nationality. It does not necessarily record where a person found safety, raised children, served a community, paid taxes, built relationships, or sacrificed for others. Damasane's life allowed Jonas to ask whether someone born outside South Africa can eventually become part of South Africa's moral community. His answer is yes. Home, in this argument, is not only inherited, it can also be built. And that brings us to Ubuntu. Ubuntu is often translated as "I am because we are." But its real test is not how we treat people already accepted as part of us. Its test comes when the person standing before us has a different accent, birthplace, or passport. Does that difference remove the person from the circle of human dignity? South Africa's constitution says the Bill of Rights protects all people in the country and affirms human dignity, equality, and freedom. It also says everyone is equal before the law. Some rights, particularly political rights, are specifically reserved for citizens, but non-citizens do not become people without rights. That is the distinction this debate repeatedly loses. Citizenship matters, borders matter, legal status matters, but human dignity does not disappear when citizenship is absent. Jonas then connects today's divisions to colonial rule. His central argument is historically important, but one sentence needs qualification. African cultural, linguistic, and political identities existed before European colonial conquest. Colonialism did not invent every African community from nothing. What colonial governments often did was harden identities that had previously been more fluid. They classified populations. They tied identity to territory and administrative authority. They appointed or empowered selected chiefs. And through systems such as indirect rule, they governed by making differences between communities more politically consequential. So, the safer conclusion is not that colonialism invented every tribe. It is that colonial rule classified, hardened, and weaponized difference. That method matters because it can survive after colonialism ends. First, identify a group. Then describe the group as fundamentally different. Attach danger or blame to the category. Finally, treat group membership as though it tells you everything necessary about the individual. Modern nationality is not identical to colonial tribal classification. States legitimately use nationality to administer citizenship, borders, and residence. But nationality becomes dangerous when it stops being one legal fact and becomes a substitute for evidence, legal status, and individual conduct. That is where Jonas's warning meets Jacinta Ngobese-Zuma's interview. Jacinta has repeatedly presented March and March as a movement against illegal immigration and failed government enforcement. South Africans are entitled to debate those failures. They are entitled to demand secure borders, functioning documentation systems, and action against employers who use undocumented labour unlawfully. But in this excerpt, the category changes. Jacinta does not begin by distinguishing undocumented people from those lawfully present. She identifies particular national communities as the people still creating the serious problem. Listen carefully.
We saw a number of them getting evacuated out of the country, but we're still not happy because the ones that are giving us a proper problem are still refusing to leave, which is the likes of the Nigerians, the Somalians, Ethiopians, the Pakistanis, the Bangladeshis. Those are the ones that have given us a serious problem, and they have this sense of entitlement that somehow they should stay in the country by hook or by crook. So we're just hoping that we'll have a government that takes this seriously and enforces much stricter ways of getting them to leave the country.
The excerpt does not establish the individual legal status or conduct of people belonging to the nationalities named. What is missing from that statement? Individual legal status: South African citizen, permanent resident, recognized refugee, asylum seeker, valid visa holder, undocumented person. These categories have different legal meanings and different possible outcomes. Nationality alone establishes none of them. One Nigerian may be undocumented, another may hold permanent residence, another may have become a South African citizen. A Somali may be a recognized refugee. An Ethiopian may have an asylum application still awaiting a lawful final decision. A Pakistani or Bangladeshi resident may hold a valid visa, run a registered business, or be married to a South African. The nationality does not answer the legal question, and this is why the word entitlement needs scrutiny. Sometimes what appears to be a sense of entitlement is an actual legal entitlement. A permanent resident is entitled to remain. A citizen born elsewhere is entitled to live in South Africa. A recognized refugee is entitled to protection. A valid visa holder is entitled to remain under the conditions of that visa. An asylum seeker may be protected from removal while the claim is properly considered. So, before describing national groups as refusing to leave by hook or by crook, the state must first ask, who is this individual, and what does the law say about this person's case? That answer cannot be supplied by a march, an accent, or a country of origin. Now, the opposite point must be made equally clearly. South Africa has the sovereign right to regulate entry and residence. It can prevent irregular entry. It can investigate fraudulent documents. It can reject asylum applications that do not meet the legal requirements. And after due process, it can remove people who have no lawful right to remain. Ubuntu does not erase immigration law, but immigration law does not erase Ubuntu either. President Cyril Ramaphosa has acknowledged that irregular migration can affect security, economic stability, and essential services. He has also said that only authorized state officials may enforce immigration law, and that private people may not confront someone in the street and demand proof of nationality. This becomes even more serious when the person came to South Africa seeking protection. In July 2026, the Constitutional Court struck down provisions that could prevent asylum claims from being considered on their merits merely because of procedural failures. The court emphasized the principle of non-refoulement. In practical terms, South Africa cannot simply return someone to a place where the person may face persecution or serious danger before the protection claim receives a lawful assessment. That does not mean every asylum application must succeed. It means the claim must be considered. However, the state cannot begin with the assumption that a nationality must leave and work backwards from that conclusion. No, South Africa has serious problems in immigration administration. Some employers exploit undocumented workers because their vulnerability makes it easier to avoid wages and labour protections. Communities may experience population growth, while clinics, schools and municipalities remain underfunded. Even government acknowledges that poorly managed migration creates real pressures and that legitimate concerns must not be dismissed. But a legitimate grievance can still produce an illegitimate conclusion. The failure of Home Affairs does not make every Nigerian illegal. Weak border control does not make every Somali removable. Employers exploiting undocumented labour do not make every Ethiopian responsible. It would also be unfair to say that all South Africans have lost Ubuntu. Millions reject violence and collective punishment. Many support stronger borders while still protecting the dignity of migrants. Others provide legal assistance, friendship, employment, and shelter to people born elsewhere. The real struggle is taking place inside South Africa. It is a struggle over whether Ubuntu still reaches the person society has labelled a foreigner. South Africa has not simply lost Ubuntu, but a visible strand of its migration politics is shrinking Ubuntu's circle. It is redefining we so narrowly that even people who have lived, worked and contributed in the country for years can suddenly become strangers. Ghana has taken concerns about the treatment of foreign nationals to the African Union. In July 2026, Ghana's presidency said the AU Commission chairperson agreed that the matter should be discussed at the next summit. It also confirmed that Ramaphosa had sent a special envoy led by Foreign Minister Ronald Lamola to meet President John Mahama. The African Commission on Human and People's Rights has separately expressed concern about reported intimidation and vigilantism aimed at people perceived to be undocumented. That is what happens when entire nationalities are discussed collectively. So, what do these two excerpts reveal? Mcebisi Jonas is right that birthplace does not contain the entire meaning of home. A person can arrive from elsewhere, contribute to a society, share its struggles and become part of its community. He is also right that political systems have repeatedly used group difference to divide people and redirect frustration. His historical claim needs qualification because colonialism did not invent every African identity. But it did classify and politicize difference in ways whose consequences remain visible. Jacinta Ngobese-Zuma is right that South Africa must enforce immigration law. She is entitled to demand effective borders and the removal of people who have no lawful right to remain. But her language becomes troubling when national communities themselves are presented as the remaining problem without distinguishing individual legal status. They do not prove illegality, guilt, or the absence of a right to remain. South Africa has the sovereign right to decide who may enter and who may remain. But a constitutional state must decide through law, not through suspicion, not through a crowd, and not through nationality alone. Ubuntu does not require South Africa to abandon its borders. It requires South Africa to enforce those borders without abandoning the humanity of the person standing before the law. So, let us return to Jonas's question. What is home? Is it only where someone was born? Can it also be where that person found safety, raised a family, served a community, and built a life? And when Jacinta names national communities as the people government must make leave, is she defending lawful immigration control? Or has nationality already replaced justice? This is the South Africa file. History, power, politics, consequences. Share your view in the comments, but challenge the argument rather than attacking nationalities. Because the moment we stop seeing the individual human being is the moment this debate has already lost its way.